More now on this big story that I spoke to you about at the top of the hour. And it is that the parole board say that double child killer Colin Pitchfork can be released from prison subject to conditions. Pitchfork was jailed for life in 1988 after raping and strangling two 15-year-old girls in Leicestershire in the 80s. He was released in September 2021, but was back behind bars just 2 months later after breaching those licence conditions. And now, apparently, he's going to be back out again. To, I think, help us understand this, I'm joined now by Barrister Chris Daw KC, I believe, as well. I think I might have just demoted you there. KC, Chris Daw. Chris, is this safe, really, that we've got this guy back out?
Well, that's for the parole board to judge. That's exactly what the parole board's job is to decide, where the parole board have a look at all of the evidence. They look at his behaviour in prison. They look at psychiatric reports, psychological evaluations. They look at all of the training courses and rehabilitation programmes he's been on over the past 35 years or so. And they make a judgment as to whether he represents an ongoing risk to the public.
I think that's the issue, though. Yeah, is that not kind of the issue, though, really, which is that I don't understand how on earth they have reached this judgment. I have read their review, and, I mean, this guy was allowed... I mean, what he did initially, you could argue, you know, for a whole host of different punishments, but we won't go down that route again, Chris. But being allowed out and then recalled for, you know, approaching women in a public place and things like this, I mean, should the parole board not ask themselves the question, would you let this guy in a room alone with your young daughter? And if the answer to that is no, then you shouldn't let him out.
Well, I suspect, I don't know for sure, but I suspect that's one of the conditions of his parole, that he's not allowed to be alone with young children.
Yeah, but why will he be allowed out at all? I mean, why should anyone like this be allowed out after they've already breached? Is it not an insult to the families of the 15-year-old girls that he raped and killed?
Well, you could make that argument for anyone who's released from prison who assaulted, murdered or attacked or raped anyone, that it's an insult to the victim or the victim's families if the perpetrator is released. And then if you follow the logic through, no one would ever be released for any of those crimes. And, of course, some people may think that's a good thing. We should have another 500,000 prison places to make room for them all. And that's a legitimate public debate. But as far as this is concerned, the parole board, which is subject, by the way, to an appeal mechanism whereby a judge can review its decision in full and can decide to overrule the decision. And then ultimately, if people are not even satisfied with that outcome, they can be taken to the courts, and judicial review proceedings can keep him in prison until there's been a decision, and if necessary, up to the very highest courts in the land. So there are processes. Are there
not some actions that should outweigh whether or not you've done some academic courses in university, whether or not you're now of an age where you're deemed to be less of a threat, whether or not that you talk a good game in front of a parole board? Some people would argue that raping and killing two teenage girls and then also breaking bail conditions on the single opportunity that you had out of prison just a couple of years ago would probably put a big rejected stamp on any future parole decisions.
Well, there's two separate issues there, aren't there? As I said earlier, if people believe that these sorts of offences deserve a whole life sentence, then that's an argument that has to be made. Of course, you can't increase the sentence retrospectively. We don't allow sentences to be increased after the event in this country. So that would be an argument about future double murderers or double child rapists. But at the moment, the law is that he was entitled to apply for parole, I think about 6 or 7 years ago, and he's clearly went way past that minimum amount of time he's had to spend in prison. And the short answer to your question is either we have a parole board that we entrust to make decisions about risk, or we don't. And if we do, then we have to let the parole board do its job, subject to all those checks and balances. If we don't believe the parole board is competent to do its job, we need to get a new body or a new way of measuring risk, because you have to measure risk somehow, because that's how parole decisions are made.
Yeah, look, Chris, thank you. Great stuff. It's Chris Daw there, KC. And Chris makes absolutely perfect points. In a sense, you might not necessarily like what he's saying, but you either have to scrap the parole board and come up with a new system that's in place, or find better people for it, really, or change the law. If you don't want monsters like Colin Pitchfork to be given parole, not once, but twice. I tell you what, I mean, can you imagine the idea of finding out that your new next-door neighbour is Colin Pitchfork? I just refuse to believe that people on the parole board would be happy for a man like Colin to be alone with their kids. And if the answer to that question is no, I wouldn't, then why on earth do you have to inflict him on the rest of us? But there we go.